Okay everyone, welcome back, and I hope you can hear me because while we are still on the potato computer and we are still in lockdown, I've got a new microphone, so please let me know if you can hear me better than you could before. And today we'll be delivering you another Dominions 5 nation analysis. We'll be moving on to the middle age of Arcos, continuing that nation line. But first an announcement that I'm probably going to have to repeat on the next couple of videos, but here it is. At long last, after several years on YouTube, I have caved to establish a Patreon, essentially. I got a couple of messages on Discord while I've been up here asking whether or not I might commission content, which is something that, I'll be honest, I'm pretty bloody flattered by. And I figured that it was time to set up a mechanism to do that. I never want to put ads on these videos on YouTube. I never want to monetize. I never want to do any of that. But the idea of having a Patreon, which will obviously never be compulsory, just so people can be involved, support me if they like, and also to provide a mechanism for people to be involved in specific activities. I thought it was time to set one up. So I put it in the description of this video link. Take a look. I've set a couple of tiers. Basically, they're split between you just want to support me and you want to be able to vote on what sort of content I might do going forward. I'm thinking of having patron polls once we start having enough of a community that people can be involved in that way. A second tier, which is I'm very appreciative of, and also people who want to be on the naming list, so you want to be soldiers in my Phoenix Point games, commanders in my other games, and also if I ever run any activities where we actually need players, so for example I host a game of Dominions, first off the mark in order for that. And finally, at the top level I've set a premium tier, which I think I've put a limit of 2, which is for people who want to commission videos, 1 commission per month. I'm pretty flexible with the topics. I'll work with you to develop them. And the idea is, if I'm aiming for somewhere between 2 and 3 free videos a week, which I'm now convinced I have the capacity to do even once we leave lockdown, there's also some space to do a couple of bonus videos for some especially dedicated patrons if they so choose. Obviously, all of this completely optional, free content will continue, but there it is. It's now a mechanism that's established, and I appreciate any support you can give. Let's move on. I'll put a timestamp so people can skip the ad break. Let's talk about Arcos, and I know you were all probably expecting Middle Age Agartha, but I decided I've done an EO Arcos guide. It's time to do Middle and Late Age because it's a less covered topic, I think, than Agartha. I think Agartha has received more attention in the community. There are more guides for it, so covering Middle Age and Late Age Arco probably for the best. We're going to do this guide in the usual format. I'm going to talk about the lore, what's changed between Early Age and Middle Age Arcos in terms of the character of the nation and the lore. We're going to go over the units and the commanders as always, talk about a couple of the strategic implications thereof, and round out with a rating of the nation and a couple of tips and tricks. So I've opened up a game with Middle Age Arcos, the Old Kingdom. This expansion is less impressive than my MA and EA Oceania expansions. I'm using the same map for all of them, so there's at least some consistency in the geography I'm dealing with. There were some difficulties, like having a whole bunch of Pegasus riders in the cap circle. There's a really tough province there with Ettins and a bunch of mages. And I had some failed expansions, but I think this one ended up at about 30 provinces. And there's 2 caveats to that. The first caveat is it's a 30 province expansion with an awake expander, right? So a significant share of my provinces have belonged to this Hound of Hades, who's been going around eating provinces and has eaten this path away from the capital. The other caveat on the flip side is that the economy is actually in pretty good shape relative to what my Oceania playthrough was. I think there's 2 forts that are established, 2 that are nearly complete. There are labs all over the place, and I've already been able to search a bunch of provinces and find gems to get my gem income rolling up. So it's a big give and take compared to Oceania in terms of the expansion story. Overall, Arcos, not as strong an expansion, but hopefully this is demonstrating that, you can do it. You'll obviously be more hemmed in a multiplayer game. That goes for all of these demonstrations. It's more just what pace can you set against indies. And Arcos is strongly in the probably 2 turns per expansion party from your capital column. Great. Let's talk lore. So here we are, Arcos, the Old Kingdom. Different nations sort of wax and wane at different stages in their timeline, and Arcos is relatively constant compared to the others. The nation itself always seems to exist. The difference is that Arcocephali becomes rather more mundane leading into the Old Kingdom from the early age. So, in the glory days of the early era, there are Pegasi on Mount Cephalos, so you have those blessable sacred Pegasus riders who are very scary. You have philosophers debating ideas and theory in the equivalent of Arcocephali and Athens. It's sort of that high Greek mythos. Over time, however, things have become just a tad more mundane. More than that, it's actually stagnated. So what's changed in Arcocephali is less the organisation of society, although there's been an extent of change there. The Oreads have disappeared. The Wind Lords are no longer a thing. And the astrologers, who in the far, far past apparently aided Arcocephali in establishing its empire, have ended their seclusion and come out to guide the current kings with the view of hopefully reinvigorating Arcocephali's empire. But for the most part, the key sort of theme of Arcocephali is stagnation. This is a nation that is still using the same tactics and techniques in terms of its hoplite and phalangite soldiers that it had in the early era. It's still, or in centuries in the past rather, there's some change with the Middle Era, still rolling them out, and this is in an era where the Amorian legions have long since succumbed and are moving into becoming the Ashan Empire. So it just captures that Hellenic idea of a nation that didn't move on beyond its sort of Hellenistic period. It's got fusions of Hellenic and Hellenistic ideas, so the use of war elephants, for example, is a Hellenistic thing, but the troop lineup is very Hellenic in nature with hoplites, and a reference to Thebes in the form of the Heart Companion. That lore segment, I suppose, seems a little bland, but that's because Arcocephali's development in this era is essentially bland. There's nothing exciting happening. Instead, the mystical elements and the richness of the nation are starting to fade away, and the people that were in charge haven't really demonstrated any real desire to reform, adapt, or expand. The nation hasn't changed that much in centuries. And that's problematic if you consider the pace of change in the universe that's going on around them. Arcocephali that is neighboured by such great powers as the various Amorian splinter states and the various other powers like that, you have to wonder, is this stagnation something that can stand Arcocephali in good stead? Moving into the late era, if you don't intervene, it will survive. It will prove to be enough, although the astrologers will eventually be overtaken and withdraw once again. But if you intervene, maybe the emergency of the astrologers is enough to catapult Arcocephali back to a position of power and overtake the Amorian splinter states, and indeed build an empire which dominates the dominions equivalent of the Mediterranean. Let's have a look at the armor you have to pull that off. So we'll look at units, commanders, and we'll look at national special abilities, and then I'll talk about summons and heroes. Unit lineup. This is a relatively simple lineup across the board. The rule for Arcocephali is apparent simplicity, but actual tactical complexity. Let's go through. First thing you've got is a trash slinger. He looks like complete shit. He has 7 morale, 5 protection, his skills are terrible, his backup weapon is a dagger, he costs 7 gold, 2 resources, and 3 recruitment points, which means the amount of these guys you can build is obscene. The sling, however, is a pretty useless weapon. 8 blunt damage at range 30, at only 10 precision, this thing's not particularly accurate, and against just about anything out there, it's not going to be doing enough damage to really hurt people. The reason the slinger exists is so you can cast flaming arrows on him. Because then every sling stone, for every 7 gold investment, with 2 resources, 3 recruitment points, produces 2 hits per turn. 1 at 8 blunt, and 1 at 8 armor-piercing fire. And 8 armor-piercing fire can mess up a lot of stuff. There are few things out there that can put out as much volume of fire from flaming arrows as the humble slinger. Makata archers are perhaps... Makatas and pygmies. Machakan Pygmies and Makata Archers are the only things I can think of that will put out more firepower per unit gold / resources and recruitment points as the Arcocephalian Slinger. So that's why they exist. They look like trash, but if you set their missiles on fire, they're useful. Then you have a collection of light and then heavy, in inverted commas, infantry. Your light infantry is split into two categories. This guy is a light infantryman. He's a formation fighter. He wears leather. The historian in me isn't sure about that, but there we go. Complete rank average independent light spear infantryman, except it has formation fighter. This is thoroughly bleh. Bleh. It's okay, and formation fighter means that square for square, it'll actually win against equivalent independent light infantry, but a lot of independent infantry have javelins, which would make this unit better. That means that a lot of time people are going to want to use the Peltast instead. The Peltast has a javelin and a spear. This is a unit that is very similar to the Peltasts that Makoni can just impress as slave troops. Can recruit as slave troops in the early era, which is pretty demoralizing. There are some disadvantages, namely that this guy has higher protection and, of course, is a formation fighter, whereas the Peltast isn't. But the Peltast has a javelin, which will at least allow him to break up opposing formations and inflict some damage before he makes contact. Then we have a lineup of medium / heavy infantry. Hoplites are hoplites. They're described as the primary line fighter of Arcocephali, and they end up in a whole bunch of Arcocephalian-influenced nations. Therodians use hoplites. Beridian lineup includes some hoplites. It's the combination of a large shield and a long spear and some armor. So, 18 protection, average ass stats, and low damage, and high encumbrance. This is your combination for a hoplite. Formation fighting, and it's tough, but it's very unlikely to actually do damage, and it gets tired pretty quickly. 31 resources, 16 recruitment points. Now, as a line holder, if its only job is to stand there and not die, then packing a line of hoplites will do the job, but you're going to need something else to win the battle for you. They won't be doing it. And while you might say this is a forgivable and understandable infantryman, and you'd be right to an extent, the damage is low, and you have to remember it now exists in an era where we're not playing against EAE nations anymore. Middle-Age Ulm is now in the game. The standard for the best infantry out there is no longer what it was. It's now Black Plate Ulmish Terminators coming for you. It's Meteorite Guardsmen walking out of the depths. The Hoplite is not impressive in the context he finds himself in. The Shield Bearers. The Shield Bearers are analogous to the lighter infantrymen that the Hellenistic powers used, usually on the flanks of the hoplite formations. So a little bit less protection, better stats, and better stats is basically your trade-off here. Attack skill 11, defense skill 13, but you have to pay 3 extra gold, which is not nothing when you produce these in significant numbers. You've got more combat speed. You also have a little bit more map move. So it's up to you on that one. The other thing is that you lose this length 4 and go down to length 3 on the spear. Length 4, at least, you might get some repels, but remember, you're only repelling at attack 11, and unlike older Dominions games, only the unit being attacked repels. It used to be that a square of hoplites or Ulmish pikeneers, the entire square would attempt repels, and that caused spear line formations to actually behave as you'd expect, fending off waves of opposing units. Doesn't work that way anymore. And then you have the Heart Companion. So these are the guys who play on the Sacred Band of Thebes, essentially. They're a bunch of blokes who are dating, married, or bonded, and they fight together in the same unit. The idea being that they will fight harder if you're fighting in the same unit as your romantic partner. So, 20 gold, decent stats, 11 attack, 12 defense, formation fighting, a long spear, sacred. 11 MR, 13 morale. This is not superb. With a bit of a bless, can be good. Most things can be good with a little bit of a bless. The problem is, as a capital-only human infantry sacred, you're limited to getting a number of sacreds equal to your holy points and your capital per turn. Plus, you're going to be resource limit on these guys. They're 31 resources, and six or seven human-sized sacreds is not as dominatingly powerful as nations which have larger and more expensive sacreds that are more efficient per holy point. Compare the amount of combat power you get for pumping out, say, an Anarchite, or in the early age, a Vanhir, compared to what you get for putting out a Heart Companion. Arco struggles to justify a serious bless because a capital-only human infantryman probably doesn't merit it. That said, they'll gladly carry whatever bless you have and be thoroughly uninspired, but at least functional, infantry. The Chariot is how I chose to expand in this game. And they're one of your 2 trampling expansion options. This is a horse-drawn chariot. It has scythe wheels, apparently, despite the model not having them. It also has a spear and a short sword, and despite the fact that this shows a spear and a guy with a bow, there is no bow. The unit does not shoot arrows. What you get here is a size 4 trampler with 13 protection, unsurroundable 1 or 2, unsurroundable 1, and 15 defense skill for 40 gold, 18 resources, 46 rec points. This means you can produce a decent number of these things out of your capital per turn. And you can expand with parties of these fairly reliably. The defense skill does a decent job of keeping them alive, as does a little bit the protection and the unsurroundable. They're not invulnerable, and you have to be careful about what you send them into, obviously. But a fast size 4 trampler can handle a lot of things if you pick your targets appropriately. So this gives Arcocephali an option to expand. The other option to expand is you can go War Elephants. You can deploy a size 6 trampler. Now here, you're spending 2.5 times as much gold, but you're going cheaper on the resources and the rec points. You're getting a size 6 trampler that has a lot more hit points, but which has lower morale, lower defense, and lower protection. On average, I find that a chariot might get killed quicker than the elephant, purely because of the reduced hit points, but it's much closer than you'd think, and you can have a lot more chariots out there doing the job, and they move at the same combat speed. So you're not really gaining anything there. The joy of Arcocephali later on comes in applying buffs to your elephants and chariots like Body Ethereal, which make them trollishly effective well beyond the point where you would normally stop producing them. So all in all, a thoroughly uninspiring lineup. You've got a trample lineup that can expand, you've got a platform for flaming arrows, you've got some line-holding infantry, and an uninspiring sacred. All in all, it's not a world-beating military force. Middle-aged Arcocephali sorely misses the Wind Riders of the early era, which were basically flying high-protection cavalry that single-handedly defined its early game expansion. You don't have that in the Middle Age. The Pegasi are no more, and you really feel it. Let's talk mages. So, Scout, nothing impressive, blah. You have a national Scout. This is like, you do or you don't, and he's amphibious or not. You do, and he's not amphibious. There, that's all you need to know. Mounted Commanders. This is like the generic mounted commander. I don't know why it's in Arcocephali's lineup. Like, maybe so you have a higher map move commander, perhaps. But what are you going to use your higher map move commander for, right? Maybe for your chariots, if you want to get them up to speed 18. That's about it. Then you have 3 infantry commanders. You have this commander at leadership 80, map move 16. This one, leadership 80, map move 14, and in exchange he has a little bit more protection. Don't hire him, hire him. Unless you're absolutely sure that your army is not going to be moving any faster than speed 14. Then you have the Strategus. Now, the Strategus is old and has map move 10. He ain't going anywhere fast. But he has leadership 120, which gives you squad morale +2 for up to 4 squads. So, the Strategoia options if morale is really important, just be aware, 1, they're old, 2, they'll die, and 3, they'll get afflictions because they're old, and 4, they'll slow your armies down to an absolute crawl. You are never moving more than 1 square if you use a Strategoi. The mages. Let's talk mages. The first one is this girl here. and she can be recruited outside forts. She's a foreign recruit. And this is an interesting thing to note for Arcos because your labs only cost 250. So there might be an argument for saying you could foreign recruit outside your forts because labs only cost 250 to set up. Unfortunately, she's sacred, so she still needs a temple. And putting temples outside of forts is something I'm really iffy on. It's like the Flamen for EA Ermal. You're just inviting raiding, and when you put a lab and a temple in a province that is not forted and presumably recruit some mages there, one, you're asking to be raided, and two, once you're raided, if that unit can remote, that can use your lab to remote out of that province and not get hit. So I don't use the foreign recruit element of these guys much. What are they? There are 7 research, priest 1, nature 1, so they can swarm on the defense. They can do a little bit of research. They halve their upkeep as research. And they're true healers. Not disease healer, true healer. So up to 1 affliction per month, not just disease, will be removed from units or commanders in the provinces that they share. Now, notably, this does not affect undead and inanimates, which means the only way to remove Tartarian problems is still Gift of Health. But everything else, this works. And this is one of the factors that makes Arcos Mind Hunt the Nation. Better, I would argue, even than the relay line at that particular activity. The Mystic is familiar. You have seen the Mystic in early age Arcocephaly. You will see the Mystic in late age Arcocephaly. You have seen the Mystic in Erythia. These guys get around. You have an Astral 1, 135 gold, this version anyway, 1 Astral, Research 12 by default, non-sacred, and then random. It's an interesting random. Fire, water, earth, or astral guaranteed 1 level, and then an independent 50% chance of getting +1 in fire and water and earth, which means you can get like fire 2, water 1, earth 1, astral 1. You can hit all of these rolls if you're lucky. This is your route to get earth 2. There is a 1 in 8 chance of getting that, for example. There's a 1 in 8 chance of getting 2 in the elemental paths, because you have to hit the relevant 50% and the 4 and in the start. So, you know, it is what it is. That's pretty good so far as a mage goes. Almost all of them are useful, and you can already see it's a pretty good communion building block. He's a bit expensive as a slave, but because he has extra paths, he's less likely to take out of path fatigue if you build your communion specifically. So you bundle the fire ones together and the earth ones together or whatnot, and you'll have a bunch of them, so you can build communions out of these guys. The Koosa, I butchered that pronunciation, is a little more gold, and I believe capital only? No, not capital only. So she's still only Nature 1 and only 7 rec points. She's a Priest 2, costs 165 gold, still only 2 recruitment points though, and she's a Healer 3. She'll remove 3 afflictions per month from the stack that she's with. So most nations in the game don't get even Disease Healer. A very few get True Healer. You have True Healer, just huge quantities of it. It is completely practical for you. All your priests have True Healer. These ladies are fantastic at healing up thug wounds, mind hunt wounds, afflictions, you name it. They'll keep units saved and in the fight. And then finally, you have the the astrologers. Astrologers are capital only and 4 rec points, so you won't want heaps of them. Their fortune teller, I think, value 10, but you probably want some luck on this nation if you're playing Worthy Heroes. And it's just Astral 3. Guaranteed, out the box, Astral 3, and then a random fire, water, earth, astral, once in a blue moon. You'll hit a second one. So you can technically hit Astral 5, it's just incredibly unlikely. That said, you can imagine that you'll hit at least some Astral 4s, which ain't bad. He is not sacred, so he's pretty expensive for the research he provides. He's not even adept researcher, but you have a recruitable Astral 5. And that's it. That's the standard lineup done. There are summons and there are heroes, but for the most part, this is a really basic vanilla-y roster until you think a little bit about the implications. Everything that isn't these nature mages has Astral, And you have access to Earth Astral built in. You will almost certainly have access to mages that have the paths necessary to get you up to the point where you're making matrices. So any magic you find can be bonded into communions, which means you are a communion nation par excellence. And by default, you have access to Earth, Water, Fire, Astral, and Nature in your communions. You are a human communion nation that is primarily elemental with a little bit of nature, and that's what your lineup is. You don't need many different types of mages to do it. The Mystic themselves is pretty much enough, with a couple of astrologers to cast the really big astral stuff at the head of the communion, and then you can wire in these nature ones if you find no other indies to do so, in order to make sure that you've got access to some of the big nature buffs as well, even though they'll be casting off-path for the slaves. In terms of special abilities for the nation, we've already talked about the 250 labs, we've talked about the healing. What we haven't talked about is about the scrying. Now, the scrying means that everywhere your dominion touches, you get this message: the priestess has scryed upon our enemies. You get pretty much perfectly accurate scouting information in every province your dominion touches. That's really good. It's good for informing your expansion, because you know what sort of units are in position. It gives you a really solid look at what's happening in those territories. And when you can push your dominion into opposing lands, you can even see maneuvering that's happening beyond your borders. So if you can push your dominion into your opponent's land, you might get a few more turns warning that they're undertaking military maneuvers than you otherwise would. All in all, a nifty ability. It's not overpowering, it's not game-breaking, but it's super handy to have. And you'll appreciate it during the expansion phase, and also, depending on how far you can push your dominion, you're probably going to appreciate it later on as well. Now, I want to talk about summons, and I want to talk about heroes. Let's give Mod Inspector a try. Okay, here we are in the Mod Inspector with the MA Arcocephali National Summons. Most of these you will have seen before in Early Age Arcocephali, but let's go through them quickly anyway. Hamadryads are what they have always been. The problem with summoning an N3 like this is that you need Nature 4 to get there anyway. The N3 that you summon is immobile, despite still being 25 gems, and doesn't have the slots needed to be a relevant boosting chassis. So I think they're interesting. I don't think that they're particularly worthwhile. Spartae give you a great battlefield summon. I've waxed lyrical on Spartae before. They're just a good use of gems for what they are. Then let's talk about some more interesting stuff. So Curs, first and foremost. So you get Curs through the Bind Keres spell at Conjuration 6. You need Death, and this is a theme. A couple of these summons require Death magic, which you do not have natively. You get 3 Keres for 12 Death gems. They're resistant to cold, they're resistant to poison, they're stealthy, they cause fear. They also increase unrest. They're ethereal, they're flying, and they are invisible, which makes them very hard to hit. As a unit, it's intimidating to an extent because the invisibility, ethereality, and the combination of having some slashing magic damage that also has this stop the dead effect, which is armor negating, paralyzing, etc. Like, there is a niche use for these. The problem with this is that it's still only 3 units, and enough attacks are going to kill 3 units. Plus, you need death magic to break into them in the first place, and 12 death gems is a fair amount. Now, if you Gift of Reason occur, it actually has hidden paths. Death 1, Blood 1. So you can get a Blood 1 mage this way, but it's very expensive as a way to get Blood 1. You have to create the Cur, who costs 4 death gems, and then you have to use Gift of Reason, which is like 25 gems or 30 gems, depending on which one you're using. So you're investing about 35 gems to basically get a Blood Hunter. You can decide if you think that's a good use of gems. I think generally speaking it's not. A game's going to have to go a really long time for that to give you a return on investment. But if you want to break into Blood, there it is. Otherwise, here is something that's here for a fear-causing chassis with these cool ghost rending attacks. Niche. But remember it's here. Keldones I've talked about before, they're your immobile, super tough communion slaves. The Hound of Twilight, I believe we've also talked about before. Get this at Conj 5. He only costs 4 Earth Gems, but you need Earth Death Cross, which again, you do not have by default. 55 hit points, relatively tough, and then a couple of high damage bite attacks and a Serpent Tail. Like, okay, mostly good because it has fear. And for 4 gems, maybe if you can buff it, you can drop some fear auras into your army. That's that. Calcatora I talked about, but the one I really want to talk about is the Lampad. And I know I mentioned this in the EA Arcos lineup, but let's mention it again. Procession of the Underworld is a death-only cast that you get at Conjuration 5. And Conjuration 5 is useful for all sorts of reasons. It's your full-sized water elementals, it's your naiads. There's a lot of good stuff at Conjuration 5, so you may end up there anyway, get Procession of the Underworld. If you do and can cast it, you create 12 of these ladies, Lampads. Lampads have Earth stats, and say they have Protection 0, and look like they rely on their magic resistance. Well, they have invulnerability 15, so they're actually pretty rugged. At least against mundane attacks. Against magic, they sort of fall apart a little bit quickly. Recuperation, Spirit Sight. Then they have this weapon, the Bainfire Torch. And the Bainfire Torch is an AoE, like, they physically hit the person with the torch. And whether they hit or not, actually no, if they hit, AoE 1 Bainfire, 8 arm-piercing magic AoE 1 damage that then does decay. It's Bainfire. Every time they swing, there's a chance that they Bainfire the square in front of them. This is handy against certain targets. There might be enemies you are facing where if you want magic AoE damage mixed in with your front line, here they are. Side effect is the bonus Stygian Guidance. This means if you use Stygian Paths, you're less likely to have the bad results where everything goes wrong. If you Gift of Reasons these guys, you get a Death 2, Astral 1, Nature 1 Mage. Now, this is basically the price of Gift of Health. So your question is, would you summon a Death 2, Nature 1, Astral 1 Human Mage for, say, let's call it 30 gems? The answer is maybe. You might summon Death 2 Mages for that. Particularly since the gems you're using to do it are Astral and Nature rather than actual Death gems. You could be using your Death gems to make actual Death summons. The reason I think this may not be the case is because there's competition with the Kakithiad, which is, I think, where you really want to get your death, well, one of the options to really get your death from. But remember that your Lampads are here, and know about these hidden paths, because they might be useful. The other thing we should think about are heroes. I've got worthy heroes loaded. So we will load up heroes, and I will talk about the ones that are not worthy heroes first, and then we'll talk about the worthy heroes ones. Top right here are the non-worthy heroes ones. So first of all, you basically get a Melia, a surviving Melia from Theridos. This gives you Nature 3, Water 1, which gives you a mechanism to, with a little bit of boosting, contact Naiads, while also being a Naiad yourself. So this is your path into breaking into regular access to higher level water and nature if you need it. It's a good little magic diversity addition. Plus, wherever she is -5 unrest per month, and she does sail a ship with humans only, but she can take people by sea, which may be something people are not expecting straight off the bat if they're dealing with Arcos. Plus, being N3, like straight out, means that she can easily boost to N4 or, with a little more expense, N5 through the use of the double-handed booster. And N5 is very respectable for getting access to higher level nature summons. So this This unit here, Axieros, gives you a big boost in terms of your nature diversity, but also your ability to access the water nature cross summons. Good pick. Then you get Pathos, who is 20 invulnerability and 16 armor, so a very tough human, 25 hit points and very high protection value, and is sacred. And his main job is to not die while being a 120 leadership or 3 inspirational 1 leader. So you get the +2 from being a leadership 120 unit, and another +1 from inspirational, meaning he is a +3 morale leader for a huge army. This helps solve morale problems, while also avoiding the age-old issue of your commander getting sniped. He's less likely to get sniped because he's got 25 hit points and he's invulnerable 20, protection 16. It's just less likely to happen. Also MR 15. Now, he still might get splattered by evocations, or crushed or whatever, by a meteor or something, but tougher and safer than ordinary commanders, and a good way to lead around larger armies and motivate them. The Hierophant is a site searcher, apparently. So here you have fire, air, water, earth, astral. Importantly, this is some of the very little air that you get access to. And that's basically it in terms of benefits. It's an efficient way to site search and bring a little bit of air into your communions if you want to deploy him. But otherwise, it's a nice way to search your lands for these paths, for multiple paths at the same time, albeit at a low level. Still, nice extra bonus to pick up when you get him. With worthy heroes, you can add Arcos, I'm pretty sure. And I might even refresh this, because I think there's one more. Sorry, I thought something was strange, and it was. Arcos is not, I believe, worthy heroes. He is another high leadership, high inspirational leader. He's less tough. He's only got 16 prot, and he's not invulnerable. But he's 160 leadership, inspirational 2, and he always has luck on. So he's less likely to be splattered by that proverbial meteor, because luck applies. 160 leadership is all you could ask for. Inspirational 2 means the morale is going to be through the roof. So if nothing else, Arcos' heroes make good leaders. Even better as a leader, arguably, is good old Alexander the Great himself, or should I say Alexandros the Conqueror. He causes fear, and is another 160 leadership inspirational 2. He's on astride Bucephalus, who in this timeline is descendant from the Pegasi of early age Arcocephali, and gives you yet another 160 leadership high inspiration commander. You're kind of drowning in them. Then you get this worthy, that's a worthy hero by the way, then you get the worthy hero multi-hero, the Muse. Again, stressing, worthy heroes. This is a modded unit, but it is a multi-hero, so it can spawn multiple times. I talked about these before, but let me briefly say again. They are Astral 3. They get a random, including the possibility at Air 2, which is your shot at your best air magic by default. They spread Dominion. They are stealthy. They are inspired researchers, meaning they make other researchers in the same province research faster, and they're multi-hero, so you could stack 4 or 5 of them in a capital, and everyone is doing 4 or 5 more RP per turn, which can be very significant. But you might also want them out in combat because they're seducers. They roll seduction checks, morale of your opponent versus 13, which means against a lot of commanders out there, they're more likely than not to pass. And if they fail, what you've got is an ore chassis, so a chassis with ore that has full slots, that has astral, and in a lot of cases will have paths that are really good in assassination. So for example, it could be a swarm assassin with nature. If it's water, it could be carrying a water bottle, or it could be carrying a water lens and a bracelet and be casting full-size water elementals. If it's air, air 2, it could be putting out air elementals, fire elementals. The options are there. This can be a really good seducer and assassin, which is another way you might get a little bit of diversity into your roster. You're not going to get many muses, even with massive amounts of luck. But the ones you do get, you'll be spoilt for choice in how you use them. Mostly it's a choice of, do you want them to prop up the domestic economy by speeding up your research and pumping out Dominion candles, because Spreads Dominion is a really good ability, or do you want them out there in the field pulling off seduction/assassinations? Either way, I think it's enough to justify the fact that if you have worthy heroes, your luck score takes on a greater degree of importance as Arcos. Let's jump back into the game. So what's my game plan as Arcos? What's my strategy? How do I use what I have available? Well, Arcos has a clear early game. Its early game is probably Trampler expansion. You could do Troop expansion. It's possible using Peltasts and Infantry. But you have the Chariots, you may as well use them. Different people have different opinions on the viability of Trampler expansion, but I've proved over a couple of tests that it certainly works. This is handy for destroying independents, but it doesn't give you a ready answer to most player armies, because most players are capable of countering size 4 tramplers, especially if you're engaging enemies that are too big to be trampled in the first instance. So you need something more. Arcos is a nation then, I think, that needs rush protection. The reason that, despite being a huge scales guy myself, and ignore these scales are wrong. I have tested it, I do not like these. It was a brain fart on my part. Arcos, despite my love of scales, is a nation that could use an early game expander / big scary monster in order to protect it from early rush attempts. There are multiple options for doing that. The example that I've given here is a Hound of Twilight. The reason I use a Hound of Twilight is because it's relatively cheap for Arcos. It has death paths, and death gives Arcos access to later summons and to break further into death magic, which is always a good late game option. The Hound of Twilight is an example which can expand early, then it can search for death gems, which makes sure that later on, when it's time to break yourself into big death summons, it can also do those big death summons in order to get units out that can ratchet you up death. It does not have full slots, but death monsters that twice spawn can basically get themselves killed and turn into Tartarian chassis, and then they have full slots, so you don't have to worry so much about the absence of slots. The other thing I'll say is that one thing I don't like about awake monsters generally is that if they rack up a bunch of afflictions in the early game, they become a little bit useless later on. Well, Arcos got true healers, so when I have time, all I have to do is bring this guy back over to a temple or wherever. There'll be a temple. I'll put a temple here, you recruit a priest, bang, give it a turn or two, and those afflictions will be gone, and it's viable again. So things like Dracons, this guy, the Hound of Hades, there are options there to maybe take an awake monster as rush protection. Otherwise, you're falling back on your diplomacy to defend you early on, because your lineup is not strong enough to ward people off before you've done a little bit of research. Once you've done a little bit of research, however, options really open up. The reality is that since you're a human communion nation, the middle game is your lifeblood. The middle game is where communions dominate, because what communions are really good at doing is doing things like evocations and summons better than anyone else in terms of the quantity of casts and also how high a cast level you can get to. So picking some spells you want your communions to deploy early for your first war is highly relevant. And you've got lots and lots of options here, because you've got, as I said, you will have access to earth, water, fire, astral, and nature in your communions guaranteed before you find any indies. So, when you decide you're going to transition to the middle game, you have to decide: are you under immediate pressure, and are you going to go into an early war? If so, you need a combat plan, so you need a magical research path that's going to allow you to fight your enemy. And if you're not, can you go greed and go construction? Because you can create research boosters because you have the requisite paths. You have a little bit of fire in the form of random mystics, which is all you ever really need in order to create the Lightless Lantern. So if you want to really boost your research up, you can go greed, you can go construction. The problem with that is that you're vulnerable until you have a magic research that allows you to actually win a battle. So I would normally not go construction 6 until you've gone to a level 5 or something that lets you actually fight and win wars. What are some examples? Well, flaming arrows is a good one. Flaming arrows can probably win you an early conflict if you're against the right opponent. You can put out a shit ton of slingers. Like if we just illustrate right now, I have a capital, the cap circle is not at all cleared. If I delete all these guys, let's go 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80. Okay, I can't do 90 slingers from one fort. But you see what I mean? The amount of flaming arrows that you can put on the field is insane. You can also do all sorts of buffs and shenanigans. Let me give you just a couple of items from that list. Conjuration gets you full-size elementals. Conjuration gets you Howl. Conjuration gets you all the spells that boost paths in your communion, so the Phoenix Power, Earth Power series, etc., which are a way to up the levels of all of your communion slaves so they take less fatigue. Also, Conjuration gives you access to ways to improve your diversity further if you've built your nation in a way that can access them. So the Lampads are there, the Caries are there, Naiads are there, Cocythiads, which should never be forgotten, are there. Eventually, things like the Fairy Court are there. There's a lot of diversity in the Conjuration field. Enchantment has a couple of things going for it. It has Relief, it has Sparte, it has a bunch of cool things there. Later on, it has some high-level death summons, it has the high-level death summon the Lich, as an example, if you want to go all the way down. Thalmatergy, Thalmatergy gives you your big astral spells, right? So your Mind Burn, Soul Slay, Syllable of Sleep. It's also what gives you Gift of Reason, which is what allows you to make your summoned units into commanders if you want to go the Lampad or Kiri's route. And one thing I'll add with the Cur is that if you have one Cur and just a couple of Blood Slaves mixed into a communion by Sabbathing, she can relief your communions and reset them to 0. So that's something to think about in terms of, is there utility of having even just 1 or 2 Blood Mages around? Maybe there is if you have really large communions out there. And then Evocation. Evocation is worth mentioning because, one, communions are very good at putting out lots and lots of evocations, and your paths are well suited to putting out a bunch of them. You might be able to do magma eruptions. You might be able to do falling frost, falling fires, so you can do those sort of evocations. You can also get Mind Hunt through evocation, which is something to bear in mind. There's a lot of synergy between different combinations of paths. So, for example, you want Thalmatergy and evocation, because together that's your Mind Hunt combination. We'll talk about Mind Hunting in a moment. That's an example of one combination. Or Conjuration, you'd want to marry that probably with Thalmatergy, because then you need... if your point of your Conjuration is to get units that you need to Gift of Reason. There's different combinations and way these paths click together. But my point is, in the mid-game, you want to be picking a set of spells that you want your communion to be able to cast, and probably the basic communion support spells to get them there, so the low-level Conjuration spells that let them boost their paths to get there, and use that to go kill someone. Use your communions to go kill someone. Sneak in Construction 6 when you can, and then keep going down, noting that there's something for you everywhere. And because you're so good at casting battlefield magic, you're going to be able to cast most of the things you encounter in the research tree, as long as you can find at least one mage with one path in the requisite area of magic. And if you're especially desperate, you could even empower. If you're really desperate for a cross path or something, you could eventually empower. The other thing that you develop in the middle game as Arcos is the finest Mind Hunt battery in the game of Dominions, arguably. Now, in this game, I've included Middle Age Relay, who are also effective Mind Hunters, because they also have recruitable Astral 3s. That, through the wonderful spell, which I will show you in Evocation, here at level 6, a level 3 Astral Mage wearing a hat can cast Mind Hunt. Plus, you can forge a reasonable number of penetration items, Eye of the Void and Spell Focus and whatnot, to give +3 penetration. And if you're really lucky, you might get your hands on some Rune Smashers as well. What does Mind Hunt do? Mind Hunt lets you target commanders in any province, whether they're hidden or not, and resolve either a Mind Burn, or if you've unlocked it, a Soul Slay attack with your mage's penetration bonus against that unit. It lets you just casually zap enemy raiders out of existence with Soul Slay once you have Soul Slay and Mind Hunt. Now, if there is an enemy Astral Mage in the province, your Astral Cord may be severed, which means your mage gets feeble-minded, which is normally a loss of a mage, except you have true healers who can eventually heal your mages back to operating standard. How important is Mind Hunt to Arcos? And to this I will say this. Against opponents where Mind Hunt is effective, it's very effective. If the enemy is relying on, for example, Elfie Raiders, where he sends single thugs out, and you're able to counter with very high penetration Soul Slays and ping him, you're going to be destroying a lot of gems of investment in terms of items and time from your opponents in a way that's really hard to counter. If your opponent has Astral Access, however, Mind Hunt's pretty useless. And that's why having it as one of your textbook-like skills means that picking your matchups is really important. Being a big Astral nation means that you thrive against opponents that have no Astral. Or, alternatively, opponents who have very expensive mages with Astral 1. Because as a person, like, you don't have the cheapest Astral ones in the game, you don't have Sequani Scargazers, but in a pinch, particularly Suicidal Mystics can be allowed to magic duel enemy units in order to take out high expense enemies with Astral 1. So don't forget that that's there. Okay, so that's your middle game. Pick something for your communion to do. Maybe get Mind Hunt if you're in a game where that's something that's particularly useful. At some point, break for the research boosters at Construction 6 so you can get some Lightless Lanterns, and then think about running into the late game. And it's in the late game where I think Middle-Age Arcos starts to run into a couple of problems if it can't diversify. And the reason I say that is because I feel this way about all the human communion nations. All of them, to be honest. Later in the game, the human communion nations can cast everything. You'll be able to cast Army of Gold, Army of Lead, Firestorm, Battlefield Wipes, Anti-Magic, Will of the Fates. You will be able to make the most incredible armies with Middle-Age Arcos because your communions will blot out the sun with their complexity and their size and their scale. There's very few things your communions can't kill. You can cast, for example, Gifts of Heaven, which means that you can just throw 150 blunt magic damage at things that you can't kill with magic resistant save or die spells, and if you can't kill them with either of those, well, maybe you can fatigue them out, maybe you can throw summons at them. Your communion is an incredible offensive power. The problem that comes later in the game is keeping a human communion alive. They're big, clunky armies, these bundles of human HP mages that, as the game goes on, become increasingly vulnerable to traps that take advantage of their poor little human HP. Like, they're 10 HP, 0 prot, old men. They're vulnerable. Unless you want to put items on all of them, they're always going to be vulnerable to things like Flames from the Sky, or Murdering Winter. You march into cold terrain and get Murdering Wintered on the offensive, your army is going to cease to exist. Your Mage Corps is going to cease to exist. The enemy throws a suicide caster, you're breaking into a cave, he throws an earthquake out. You better make sure that you have scripted something that will land before that 20 damage earthquake does, because your 8 defense old, human dudes, 7 defense human dudes are going to get absolutely destroyed. In the late game, the amount of firepower... Sorry, let me go back a step. In the middle game, your firepower as a human communion nation ramps up far quicker than your opponents, right? Communions are a very fast path to access ungodly amounts of evocation and battlefield buffing firepower. You can pile it on, and when it's a firepower competition, you're winning. You're winning in the middle game, you're winning in the early late game. But once the battlefield becomes saturated with super dangerous things, your communions are going to start to struggle to stay alive against things that can drop lots of devastation in the early rounds of combat. And that's why you might find you start to fall off a little bit. What that means is that you need the research to get to the late game earlier and to diversify into tougher and more capable fighting options, or to close out the game before that becomes the case. The one thing I'll say is that the normal sort of super combatant thug play that tends to replace big armies in the very late game, you can partly mitigate unless they have defenses against Mind Hunt. You're going to force your opponent to make that call, and you can afford more risky speculative Mind Hunts, because even if you lose some mages, their minds will be healed back. So how do I rate Arcos overall? And then I'll add just a few more thoughts at the end. Middle Age Arcos is weaker than Early Age Arcos. Losing the Wind Riders is a problem, and the Mystic, the addition of the S3 Astrologer is not worth the loss of the Oreads that gave it really big nature early in the game. So I consider Middle Age Arcos weaker at the same time as it's up against stronger opponents. It's got scrying, it's got a weird power curve where it's weak. It sort of does decent against indies, and then it's weak in its first war, so it needs an awake or something like that to defend it, and then it does really well the first time it can convert its communions into something combat worthy. So the first time you get flaming arrows or full-size elementals, and you can start doing something with your communions, your power spikes because suddenly you can deploy your mages and wreck your opponents. There's another power spike at Mind Hunt, but only against very specific opponents. And your power keeps ramping up with this little, as your human communions get more devastating. And then there's a bit of a drop-off as human communions become less and less able to operate. The world just becomes too dangerous. Remote attacks become too common. Tough enemies that can devastate battlefields are there. So you need to be sure you have an endgame. Whether it's death or high-level conjuration, whether it's elemental royalty or Tartarians or liches, you need to make sure you have access to a late game, which is one of the reasons why I liked in this gun. I was just trying out to see whether or not I could get a dog with a couple of paths out there that would be able to break me into other things in the late game. For all these reasons, I consider Arcos its average. Most nations should receive an average or just above or below average rating, right? So a majority of nations should receive an average rating. Middle Age Arco is average, and depending on the game, it's slightly above or below average. Against the right opponents, where it's one trick, it's one cool tricks work. So if Flaming Arrows works against your opponent, or Mind Hunt works against your opponent, congratulations, you're in the money. Heck, fighting against Celeria, a Celeria we know fails to mass flaming arrows from pygmies early in the game. Arcos can kind of do it with slingers. So against specific opponents, bump you up a little bit, but against opponents who don't care about your few neat tricks, you're going to face a little more trouble, and as the game goes later and later, more trouble mounts unless you're able to transition away from using the core of your nation. So there we are, average. What would I recommend in terms of gods and scales? Well, I favor something awake and scary or dormant and scary to help Arcos out. If you think you can expand just fine with the chariots and the elephants or even the infantry, you might even want to dormant your scary thing. That's something worth considering. For your scales, it depends on what you're going to be using. If, like me, you're thinking of chariots and then eventually flaming arrows, you probably don't need the 2 production I took, but you probably don't want the turmoil 1. I would dump temperature. I'd grab growth as always. A little bit of luck if you're playing worthy heroes. If you're not playing worthy heroes, the luck doesn't matter as much, and your capital only mages are fortune tellers, so maybe dump luck. And magic helps. Magic always helps. I'm a fan of magic scales for anyone for whom research is important and doesn't come easily. And for Arcos look, 12 research is perfectly fine, perfectly fine. But if you can afford a magic scale, maybe you take a magic scale as well. You don't need like incredibly good scales, but you may as well get them because you don't need a bless. Put the points into scales and also the chassis that you are using to defend yourself, and that chassis needs to give you a deterrent, either awake or dormant, and it needs to give you diversity in the late game. It needs to give you a path or a plan that you wouldn't otherwise have. Death is a classic example of that. So the Hound transitioning into a Tartarian chassis and being the thing that pulls out the Wraith Lords or the Mound Fiends or the Liches or whatever the case may be. That's just one example. Those are my thoughts on Middle Age Arcocephali. It's average, bland. It's a human communion nation par excellence, similar to MA Tianqi in that respect, just less focused on dropping rocks on people. And in exchange, it pays a little bit more in order to be a little bit more versatile in what it can do with its communions. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this guide. We'll come back with late age Arcocephali soon to wind up the Arcocephali line. Again, check out my Patreon if you are interested, and let me know about the new sound quality on the new microphone. Until then, stay safe, everyone. Hope COVID stays under control in your respective jurisdictions, and I'll see you all soon.